A welcome back to people who are joining us on Zoom, and welcome for those who are joining us for the first time. For those who are joining on Zoom and new, I'm Chandra, and I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the Boston University School of Public Health. On behalf of our school, welcome to the second session of today's event. First of all, I thank you to everybody who joined for this morning's discussion about shaping an anti-racist approach to building a diverse academic community. We're now moving to the second panel, and in this session, we're going to hear from our speakers on how we can build anti-racist academic institutional policies. I'm going to turn the event over to the moderator of the second session, Dr. Debbie Bazarski. Dr. Bazarski is the inaugural director of Boston University's LGBTQIA+ Center for Faculty and Staff. For the past 2 decades, her career has focused on a comprehensive range of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, including being the founding director of 2 other LGBTQIA centers at Princeton University and University of California, Santa Barbara. She has also served as Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Dean of Enrollment, Engagement, and Diversity at the Pennsylvania College of Art and Design, and as a Senior Diversity Inclusion Practitioner at Princeton University. She derives the greatest professional satisfaction from fostering partnerships that make equity and inclusion a shared responsibility and lead to systemic institutional change. Dr. Bazarski, welcome.
Thank you, Dean Galea, for that very kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's afternoon panel, Building Anti-Racist Academic Institutional Policies. This morning's session was excellent and focused on building a diverse academic community. To the points that were made this morning, the convergence of systemic racism, institutional racism, the lack of meaningful and ongoing institutional commitments via both funding and follow-through, and issues of access and support. Institutions are often slow to making transformative change. Institutional policy work is an important piece of this puzzle as we think about transformative change. Today we have an all-star panel to speak with you about building academic institutional policies. A quick note about the event's format, similar to this morning. Before we begin the introductions, I just want to note that after all of our speakers have presented, we'll have a moderated discussion up here, and after which we'll take questions from the audience as well as from online. So if you're online, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box. And if you're here in the audience, we'll invite you to raise your hand. We'll have a handheld mic that we'll pass around. With that, I think I will begin. We have a wonderful panel, and the first person I will introduce today is Professor Chandra Ford. Dr. Chandra L. Ford is Professor of Community Health Sciences and founding director of the Center for the Study of Racism, Social Justice, and Health in the Fielding School of Public Health at the University of California at Los Angeles. Her work offers conceptual and methodological tools for studying racism as a public health problem. She originated with Dr. Collins Ahenbua, the Public Health Critical Race Praxis, which is a framework for applying critical race theory empirically. Dr. Ford has received many teaching awards and several notable honors, including the 2020 Wade Hampton Frost Award from the Epidemiology section of the American Public Health Association. Dr. Ford, I'll turn it over to you.
So thank you very much, Dean Galea, for the invitation. It's really exciting to see the kind of work that's happening here. I also want to say how humbled I am to be amongst this very distinguished panel, and I want to just go ahead and jump right in. So my orientation to this panel is as a person who's working in and having founded a center focused on racism that's housed within a school of public health. In my remarks, I'll discuss this center, provide a little background on it, identify just 3 types of policies that I think would enable such a center to thrive, and then conclude by introducing what I believe are some important sticky tensions that we must address. I come to you from Southern California on lands originally inhabited by and cared for by the Gabrielino Tonga peoples. I think about this every day and what it means to come to my work with an anti-racism orientation as a woman who identifies as the descendant of slaves from the U.S. South, and think about the many ways in which we who even, those of us who are fighting against racism in all its myriad forms, still benefit from the historical and ongoing injustices visited upon the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And I think it's important to always bring that into any conversation that I have. So the Center for the Study of Racism, Social Justice, and Health was established in 2019 after a number of years of work towards that goal. And the goal of the center really was to create an intellectual home where folks who were already doing work around racism and health, as well as those who were wanting to do this work, could come together in order to build the integrity and the rigor with which we carry out this work. It's among the first centers of its kind to be housed in a school of public health, and it's developed based on the public health critical race praxis, really developed based on a grounding in critical race theory. The mission of the center is to advance rigorous research, innovative teaching, and community engagement around racism and various forms of social injustices in order to promote health equity. By many standards, we have been far more productive than I originally anticipated, in part because my original vision was for a small, relatively small center. But the need is great, and there is considerable interest and readiness, I believe, to address racism within public health and more broadly. Just to give you a sense of the kinds of activities in which we engage, we are routinely, just if you think about like a typical week, conducting our sponsored research, so the NIH work has to get done, responding to requests for information about racism as a public health problem from schools, elected officials, from students, from community members, from colleagues, supporting community partners in their ongoing efforts. Those efforts may or may not be specifically tied to health equity as we in public health might define it, but remaining committed to them means supporting them in the work that they're doing. Planning and hosting speaker series, supporting our affiliates through activities such as journal clubs and book clubs, for instance, the Anti-Colonialism Collective Book Club, which was started by a doctoral student, Anna Michelle McSorley, in alignment with her dissertation work. And Anna Michelle McSorley is one of the doctoral students who recently graduated, our first large cohort of doctoral students to graduate from the center, and is now moving to New York University. And her dean is here in the office, in the symposium right now today, where we're looking at now how do we bridge the work around anti-colonialism, knowledge production around anti-colonialism, public health practice around anti-colonialism across these two institutions, and then certainly mentoring students. The question on which I have been reflecting in preparation for today's conversation is, what does it take for anti-racism centers in schools or programs of public health to thrive? And what I want to offer is just 3 policy considerations. I agree with much of what we've heard today, and then these sticky tensions. Very briefly, anti-racism has been defined in a number of ways, and I don't need to say that for folks who are here at Boston University. But very simply, I will just say we can think of anti-racism as a commitment to dismantle racism across all socioecological levels. So the first kind of policy I would say we need is policies that change the incentive structure. And this is important to increase the benefits of faculty engagement in particular in unconventional or risky equity-oriented endeavors. Let me contextualize this by saying that I have spent my entire career focused on racism as a public health issue. And it's wonderful to have great support for that work over the last 2 years. But much of this work has actually been done walking against the grain of the field, not walking with the field. And so there has been little support for people who are trying to do that work, both in terms of actual financial support, but also even being able to see the work as relevant to what the rest of the field is doing. It's important to consider both financial and non-financial incentives, and it's important to count the invisible labor that Black, Indigenous, and people of color folks do, and other folks do, to make this successful. It's important to have policies that supply resources according to need. And here I'm thinking about the way that former president of the American Public Health Association, Kamara Phyllis Jones, defined equity as assurance of the conditions for optimal health for all people, and went on to explain that to achieve equity, we must value all individuals and populations equally, recognize and rectify historical injustices, and provide resources according to need. So in terms of centers thriving, at issue here is the tendency of policies to advance the interest of marginalized groups, right? So to address issues of inequities within institutions, but to do so primarily when it's going to benefit non-marginalized groups. And what that results in then is a continuation of the disparity, or at least it has the potential to. And finally, we need policies that reframe what equity, diversity, and inclusion are. Can we move away from the tendency to view BIPOC people through a deficits model? Can we move away from the tendency to treat BIPOC people as, and I think this is related to the first point, perpetual mentees? It's different to relate to the institution as a junior person of color, but what does it mean to respond to or to answer to a senior person of color in the institution? Can we move away from the failure to call into question how privilege is operating? And you can see these 3 points are related. As long as we continue to frame the problem in terms of disparities and lack of diversity being about the need simply to help the disadvantaged, I'll use that kind of framing, we will fail to recognize the relative ways in which privilege is at work. And then can we move toward establishing policies based on perspectives that may be unfamiliar because they originate among marginalized populations? Can we move towards supporting work on health equity as well as work on institutional diversity? These two are not synonymous. And then can we support work that advances both? And I believe that if we do that, we can really advance both. There are some sticky tensions that I really only have time to just quickly list here. And they include and these are really tensions. You know, you can think of them as a tug of war that we need to grapple with, and that going into the development of a new center, I would recommend having great clarity about where one stands and what the center is trying to accomplish. The first is recognizing this tension between the role of institutional service versus the role of research and scholarship. So the big danger here is that people who are seeking to advance their research and scholarship may end up in an environment where they are reduced to doing racism 101 sessions, which does anything but advance and deepen their scholarship. So there's a real danger in terms of actually advancing the knowledge. It's important to think about the tensions between creating a safe space versus an intellectual space. Ideally, we want both in one space. The truth is that in the current societal context, we must consider the ways in which safe spaces for talking about racism can be, spaces that are intended to be safe spaces for talking about racism can actually not be safe spaces because they're motivated by a variety of interests, including access to research funding, the desire simply to study racism disconnected from the heart work that many others come to the work with. So a secondary question then is, if we decide that this should be a safe space in which the intellectual work can be done, what does it mean to try to enforce safety in a space? And there are a variety of things to keep in mind, including, for instance, legal considerations. Another set of sticky tensions arise when we think about the aversive forms of racism that are salient in the early 21st century, according to critical race studies. There are a number of tensions regarding public-facing versus institutional roles and responsibilities of these centers. Sticky tensions regarding the stakeholders to whom the work and the affiliates in the center are most accountable. Is it the funding source, or is it those who the communities that would benefit from the work? And finally, there are a number of sticky tensions related to tokenism and going into circumstances where tokenism we might well know that we're being tokenized, but can we do some sort of cost-benefit analysis based on things like balancing tokenism versus the perception of not being collegial or a team player, gaining from the benefits of increased visibility, but there are also a number of cons to that, and the need to engage in truth-telling versus the tensions that arise with tokenism. So I will conclude simply by saying that this is a critical moment as the number of centers in schools of public health and elsewhere is increasing rapidly, and it's important if we want to think about sustainability that they have the substantive support needed to stay there and to be effective over the long haul. If anti-racism centers are to thrive, institutional policies must change the incentive structure for engagement, supply resources according to need, and reframe EDI. I think that the sustainability of these centers will ultimately hinge on clarity, the level of clarity, and ability to adhere to and address these sort of sticky tensions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ford. We will now hear from Dean Debra Furr-Holden. Dean Furr-Holden currently serves as the Dean of NYU School of Global Public Health. She is also an epidemiologist and nationally recognized leader in health equity, research, practice, and translation. Dean Furr-Holden has worked extensively with a wide range of partners, including community-based organizations, local municipal offices, and national policymakers on community-driven and evidence-informed interventions to promote health equity. Among her many awards, she was the recipient of the 2006 Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, given out by the Office of the White House, and the 2021 Service Award for the Society for Prevention Research. Dr. Furr-Holden.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to try to move with some efficiency because I had the great benefit of knowing some of the things that my colleagues were going to talk about. So anybody who knows me knows equity is my thing, it's my jam. My push is that we mandate equity. I say if there is political will, if there is goodwill, there is a legislative way. I know that most people won't do the right thing simply because they're asked to. Remember being a child and you had curfew, and the first time you violated curfew and nothing happened, what did you do? You continued to violate curfew. But that time you came home, and I remember my mom was sitting in the living room on the couch, smoking a cigarette. It was dark, and all I could see was the billow of smoke, and I knew that I was in a world of trouble. Well, after that night, suffice it to say, I didn't break curfew anymore. There were rules that were in place. So this push around mandating equity, and this is, again, relevant to the conversation around how do we, and I'll talk a bit about it, get these anti-racist policies and practices baked into institutions. Our natural drift is to inequity. We don't have to do anything to be an inequitable society, right? And our first speaker, sort of gave the T.D. Jakes definition, right? Operating in a society that wasn't built for you. I think it's even worse than that. Racism got baked into our society. It was actually built in and institutionalized in our founding. Most isms, racism, sexism, we the people, didn't include women or people of color, right? So it actually got baked in. So our natural drift is to inequity. So if it matters, it needs to be policy and law. Those mandates would give stakeholders the pull to figure it out and to partner. And I'll give you a specific example in a sec. Mandates push people to figure it out, and they also inspire communities of practice. We've already heard a few examples, and we're gonna hear more from some of my other colleagues about what they're actually doing in their institutions, specific programs. So I took that stuff out of mine, because the stuff that they're doing, I'll just go, amen, bravo, I agree with that. So again, if equity matters, this is what I want you to get. It has to be mandated, enforced, and it has to be attached to resources. So let me give you two ways to think about it. Anybody who's heard me talk knows I love this example. It's the first time I ever baked a cake with my daughter, Olivia, who, as it turns out, is graduating with a business degree and now is headed off to culinary school. So lo and behold, we produced a little chef out of this work. So the first time we baked a cake, Olivia said, I want to bake a cake from scratch. And I'm a box cake kind of mom, right? Like, working mom, I call it box cake surprise. I'll throw some applesauce and other key special ingredients in and surprise people that this is a box cake. She didn't want that. So we go to the store, we get all the ingredients. Once the cake is baked, she's over at the wall, looking in the wall oven, and I'm cleaning up, and what do I notice on the counter? A box of Domino sugar unopened. We have baked the whole cake, and we did not put the sugar in. So she sees me, and she says, Mom, what's wrong? I said, oh, sweetie, we made a mistake. We baked the whole cake, and we forgot to put the sugar in. And what do you think she said? She's like 6. She said, well, can't we sprinkle some on top? And I thought that was really cute, right? She's 6. And I was like, we could, baby, but it won't taste like a cake. But that's what we do with equity. We do it as adults. You all do it as institutional leaders. Our institutional leaders do it. They try to sprinkle these little things on top and lose sight of and forget that it was not baked in. We have a fundamental missing. And it's cute when it comes out of the mouth of a 6-year-old. It's not really great when it comes out of our institutional leaders' mouths and they do things and just try to sprinkle it on top. So what I say we have to really do is we have to get it attached to the thing that matters to people. And it becomes this question of the carrot versus the stick. And I say we need both, right? The carrot is that real incentive for people to do the right thing, and sometimes the stick being the prod that people need to do the right thing. So I'm gonna give you one more example, and then I'm gonna summarize, because you probably just got a lot about institutional equity that you didn't realize. And I'm only gonna use 6 minutes of time. So here's my son, Gabriel. Love this kid. This is a picture of him about 10 years ago at a Hopkins seminar with Cornell West. It was like the coolest day ever. So Gabriel, when he was an elementary school student, was like a straight A student. Then he goes off to middle school. And what happens in middle school? Those grades start to slip. By the time he's in 8th grade, we call him C's and D's, because that is what his report card is, all C's and D's. And he comes home and says, I want a PlayStation in my room. And I said, great, you want a PlayStation in your room, get straight A's. And he said, if I get straight A's, you'll give me a PlayStation? I said, absolutely. So what do? I go, I buy the TV, the little flat screen TV for it. I buy the PlayStation. I put it in the foyer of our living room. And every day when he comes home, he has to walk by it. I didn't get this kid a tutor. I didn't help him do his homework. I didn't go up to the school and talk with his teachers. I just attached the incentive that mattered to him to the outcome that I wanted. That kid got 5 A's and 1 B. He got an 89. I said, sorry, bud, you swung and you missed. This ain't horseshoes or hand grenades. You didn't get it. You know what he did? I didn't give him any coaching. I didn't do anything. He went back to that school and negotiated with that teacher something. I am not kidding you. And she turned that 89 into a 90, wrote him a letter, crossed it out on his report card and said a new one will be mailed to you, but I attest that Gabriel did the work and blah, blah, blah. And he came home, and what did I do? I gave him his PlayStation. See, when I talk about when you attach it to the thing that matters, it will inspire people. If you attach it to institutions and institutional outcomes, it'll inspire the institutions who are figuring it out to partner with the ones who are not, or to inspire the ones who are not to figure it out from the ones who are. What if those incentives were regional, so that no one institution could pop their chest out and say, not our problem? But if every institution in Boston, whether it be BU, Harvard, or Brandeis, had a metric, and if all of you didn't get it, then none of you got it, and your state funding got cut. These mandates would enforce and require people to figure it out. And just like Gabriel, I know that they can do it. So in the C-suite, my colleagues are going to talk about it. I'm not going to go through it. People should be using their positions of power to elevate people of color, doing the fearless work to identify where they are and are not standing true to what they espouse as values, and adding qualified people in the suite. And just simply being somebody of color does not qualify you, or being in an underrepresented group, to do the work of social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I know my colleagues will figure that out. I always put the takeaways there at the end. It's just a recap of what I said. And I'll leave you with this last thing, because a lot of times people say, we can't afford to do it. We don't have the money. It's too hard. It's this circular lesson we learned from the movie Friday. And if you remember, Craig got fired for stealing boxes on his day off. And he had to pay Big Worm $200. So he goes to his mom and he says, Mom, loan me $200. And she says, well, Craig, I wouldn't feel comfortable lending you money without a job. And he says, but if I had a job, I wouldn't need to borrow money. And she said, exactly. That's what we do with this work. We get stuck in these circular loops that make no sense and give us all an excuse to run around in circles. And we just have to move forward. Thank you. I'll take questions at the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Furr-Holden. Now we will hear from Dean Perry Halkitis. Dean Halkitis is currently Dean of the Rutgers School of Public Health and professor in the departments of Biostatistics and Epidemiology and Urban Global Public Health. He is also the founder and director of the Center for Health Identity, Behavior, and Prevention Studies. Dean Halkitis is a public health psychologist, infectious disease epidemiologist, applied statistician, researcher, educator, and advocate. Dr. Halkitis.
I've never spoken after my buddy Deb. So I'm actually thrilled to be doing that today. I want to start, first of all, by saying it would be wrong for me not to start my comments by first acknowledging that today, 4 billion people around the world were watching a funeral of a 96-year-old woman who ran an institution that enslaved people and colonized people. At the same time, 3 million people on the island of Puerto Rico are living without electricity. So as we have this wonderful conversation about anti-racism in our own institutions, including here at the amazing BU and at Rutgers and other places, let's keep in mind that ultimately the work that we're doing at this level is about the people who are affected every single day. Right, and so my thoughts and prayers out to the people in Puerto Rico, and we have to continue to put up that fight, that good fight. How do I relate to this work? Well, I have a little summary that I'm not going to read to you, but you can read it for yourself while I have it up there. But while I tell you that over the course of the last 5 years, I've been in this role as Dean of the School of Public Health, and I could say to you that 5 years ago, when I was at another institution where my friend Debra is now, this work would have been easier. it is much more challenging in my current institution. And so my relationship to developing anti-racist policies at the Rutgers School of Public Health is in part shaped by this institution that I've landed in. And I'm actually loving it. Like, I'm a Piagetian. I believe in disequilibrium. I believe that, you know, you grow when you push yourself and you think widely. And over the course of the last 5 years, I've had to learn how to think widely in a way that I didn't have to think about that before. Number two, I've had the great privilege over the course of the last few years as a representative at the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health to develop two really critical documents that around racism and discrimination. First, I think it was 2019. I don't know what year we're in anymore. Is it like 1952? I have no idea where we are. But in 2019, I think, we put out a document on discrimination and harassment in schools of public health that was published in Public Health Reports, where we began to think through what do we need to do as institutions to fight those conditions that shape our schools and our programs. And then with my dear friend Linda Alexander, over the course of the last couple of years, developed a set of strategies and recommendations, long, medium, and short term, for developing anti-racist policies and anti-racist procedures and curricula at schools and programs of public health. And if you haven't seen that, that's available at the ASPPH website. And over the course of the next few years, we'll be working with all the institutions to figure out what we're all doing, because each of us is doing something. None of us is doing everything, right? And some of us are doing some things very well, and some of us are doing other things very well, and how can we learn from each other? So I come to this work also as, you know, as it says at the bottom of my slide there, you know, as a white man, right, as a white gay man who thinks he can pass as straight. I don't really know if I can pass as straight or not. I think I'm so gay. But as this white man who came from this immigrant family, and who struggled, but at the end of the day, my struggle was the struggle of a white man. And that was a very different kind of struggle. And if I don't own that, and if I don't say that, and if I don't do that in front of you, then shame on me for doing that. And that's what I do every single day in my position at the Rutgers School of Public Health. I don't have the answers for how we're going to change our institutions, but I come back to this really important point. Why do we need anti-racist institutional policies? Because people's health and well-being is being adversely affected. And I just have up there for you 3 snapshots. First, or monkeypox, which I like to call orthopox 59. Orthopox 59, which, as you see, is manifesting, not surprisingly, differently across race, both in terms of infection and in vaccination. The next picture over there, maternal mortality, which manifests differently across race also in our country. And last but not least, the immigration crisis in our country, where people are being trafficked and shipped from southern states up to your state and others, and to my home city of New York. This is why we're doing the work. This is why we need anti-racist institutions. This is why we need anti-racist policies at our schools, to develop a set of scholars, researchers, practitioners, advocates, and activists at our institutions that go out there and fight these realities. But we cannot do this work unless we check ourselves and deal with the racist ways of our own institutions. So, how do I do this work? And I'm just going to leave you with my perspective. Oh, and this is that. I don't know. So CDC finally realizes that too, that maybe they should be doing actually work for people. As I said when I first got to Rutgers, we do public health work. Public. Not behind the computer, a little behind the computer, but mostly in the public, right? And I'm really proud to say that the school has evolved into that over the course of the last 5 years. And this op-ed that I wrote in The Hill is really about that idea of how we keep public service and public interest at the center. So to me, the way I continue to challenge this every single day at my institution, and my institution exists, our school exists within the structure of a biomedical health science institute that is often directed by MDs, no disrespect, Sandro, by MDs, often white, often male, cis, and heterosexual. And so that's my reality that I'm dealing with. So how do I try to convey to them we need to think about policies that give an equal chance to everybody? Well, I frame it around this idea of inclusive excellence. The idea that excellence is not just one thing. It is many things. It can manifest in many different ways. And for me, the inspiration for a lot of this happened in 2007 when I read this report by ETS of all places that wrote a report called The Perfect Storm, right? And in that report, they discussed the ongoing shifts that were going on in our country, both in terms of the demography of our country, but also the literacy of people and the skills that we needed from future workers. And they said very foretellingly, is that a verb? Is an adverb? Foretellingly? It's going to be now. If we maintain our present policies, we will likely continue to grow apart with greater inequity in wages and wealth and increasing social and political polarization. Yeah, things like we're there right now. Right? And it's because we haven't really addressed these things. And I raise these for you because I think one of the challenges we have at our institutions is to address those 3 bullets up on top. Right? Number 2, the idea of inclusive excellence, which is, of course, has been developed for colleges and universities to think about student learning, to me has an equal application when we think about faculty. Our students cannot excel if our faculty cannot excel. Next idea, inclusive excellence requires that we define excellence at our institutions in many different ways. My challenge every single day is to argue that we cannot have people, teachers and different faculty members in different buckets. That in fact, everybody has a portfolio that sometimes is more scholarship and sometimes is more pedagogy. And that each of us has this portfolio, and that each of these pieces that constitute our pie contribute to who we are and what we provide to our institution. So putting people in separate types of faculty lines doesn't really help that, right? What it does is it others people who are not on a tenure track line, right? And often those people who are not on a tenure track line are people of color. They go into the teaching line because, they're not as good as the people on the tenure track line. And that's a reality that I face every single day. The other thing that we have to think about when we think about inclusive excellence is having a faculty that is diverse, but not just diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, absolutely. Diverse in terms of the populations that we serve, in terms of the students that we teach, in terms of the disciplines involved in public health work. I think we all remember that public health came together with a variety of disciplines coming at this intersectional crossroad. Like I'm a psychologist and an epidemiologist and an activist and an educator. We're not just one thing, and I think we've lost that a little bit, that richness of public health that we need to relive. And then the diversity of the scholarly work that exists in public health. Right, so one of the challenges I think I have every single day in my life also is fighting this idea that somebody is a good scholar only if they have a large H-index, right? And it's more than just somebody's H-index. That was supposed to be like a joke. You were supposed to fill in the blank there. I don't have a majorly gay audience, that's why. The other thing is the need to uplift voices. And finally, I think this is my last slide, the way we assess excellence has to be multidimensional. And I spent some time in a classroom teaching children when I was doing my doctorate, which was amazing. Yes, Lin-Manuel Miranda was actually in my class, that's correct. You can talk to me about that later. It's like my claim to fame, right? But in fact, as we think about how we assess excellence, this is a critical element because that is tied directly to how we evaluate people and the values we keep on what actually matters. And excellence has to be defined in this multi-dimensional way, and I think you're all familiar with the Murray book from like 1994, if you haven't read it, which is like if you have a high IQ, you do well, and if you have an IQ, you're probably Asian but not black, and it's just a mess, that book. And then Howard Gardner's really beautiful multiple intelligences theory, which I keep very close to my heart, because everybody has some intelligence in some way, right? Like, so I have like high mathematical intelligence, but don't ask me to sing, right? And then last but not least, inclusive excellence requires that we address discrimination in the tenure and promotion process. So if we continue to have this unitary definition of what excellence is like and what a tenured faculty member looks like, then we're not going to diversify both the skill set that is present in our school, in our schools, in our universities, in our classrooms, and the type of people who we attract. Diversification and inclusion does not mean lowering of standards. I have spent the last several years having this fight that, no, I'm not trying to lower standards. I'm not going like this, we're trying to go like this. And I think we all have to figure out a way to embrace this more holistic way of thinking about excellence in academia. This most holistic way of thinking about excellence will naturally be tied to anti-racist, anti-homophobic, anti-women policies that exist at all our institutions, that you know that they're there. And ultimately, we will get to a place that where actually our universities and our institutions look like the people we are trying to actually, lives we're trying to improve. You can find me there on the Twitter and on the other thing, wherever I am. Thank you very much for indulging me.
Thank you, Dr. Halkitis. We will now hear from Dean Maureen Lichtveld. She currently serves as the Dean of the School of Public Health, the Jonas Salk Chair in Population Health, and Professor of Environmental and Occupational Health at the University of Pittsburgh. As Dean, Dr. Lichtveld oversees 7 academic departments, 640 students, 160 faculty, and 320 staff. Her research focuses on environmentally induced disease, health disparities, climate and health, environmental health policy, disaster preparedness, public health systems, and community resilience. Dr. Lichtveld.
Greetings. It's really an honor to be among my colleague deans, to be hosted by one. And did you notice that every one of us started with a personal story? Because that's where we come from. So my personal story, as you can hear from my accent, I wasn't born here. And speaking about cultural adjustment, so I was asked where I'm from, and I thought, how could I share in a few seconds that I was the youngest and first female working in the Amazon rainforest, serving the descendants of slaves and indigenous populations? How can I tell them that that's where I really learned what the value of a community health worker was? And not in 20 years at CDC. How can I tell them that I too lost everything because I joined Tulane 3 weeks before Hurricane Katrina? But how can I tell them that there is no way to compare the assets that I had with the people who lost everything in the lower Ninth Ward? How can I tell them that because of Hurricane Katrina, I left behind a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old with a husband while I felt committed to work with the people in the lower Ninth Ward? And so that's the story that each one of us have. And what I wanted to share, I learned when I joined Pitt. People ask me, well, why did you leave New Orleans to join Pitt? The climate is a little different there. I said, because all the assets were there, particularly in one of my 4 strategic imperatives, and that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they're not necessarily connected and leveraged. I've also learned that we are the city of the largest number of bridges, 456 or something like that, so come visit us. So this afternoon, what I'd like to do is discuss a framework for advancing anti-racism strategies on campus. And I had my great colleague here already earlier this morning to highlight some needs to examine and replace some policies and to discuss the importance of stakeholder engagement. So one of my 4 priorities, as I mentioned before, is diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it's also that of the entire university, where we created a culture change initiative. I mentioned culture, and I started my story with culture because that's how we learn, by knowing each other's, by taking time to know each other's culture and agreeing and committing to changing it, in this case, the DEI piece. I'll come back to what we're doing in the school. One of the things I've learned, and I don't know whether you know it, and I might be late to the table to learn that, is that the term pipeline is actually offensive to our indigenous brothers and sisters. It is, pathways is a preferred term, and so you'll see me doing pathways, using pathways instead of pipelines. So the plan for Pitt has a number of values that you could see, but I want to emphasize the 3 goals. So as all universities, there were 6 goals and an equal number of objectives, and by the time you're done, you're 15 pages deep, and very difficult to measure what actually needs to get done. And so there are now 3 goals: our people, who we are at the university, our programs, what it is we do, but I'm particularly keen on what our purpose is. And our purpose is where communities are the central piece of what we do. We joined with 57 other universities the Inclusive and Diverse STEM Faculty Institutional Change Network, the iChange Network. And we haven't talked about it. I'm looking forward to talk about data, how we collect data, how we analyze data, but particularly how we share data. How we share data not only among us, but how we share data with our communities. And so that self-assessment process is currently ongoing. As part of, as you have already heard, the George Floyd incident, our community, our academic community, stood up and said, we need to start that learning at the earliest possible time. And yes, we could have made it a required course, and it is, but what we're doing is we're automatically enrolling all first-year students. So they don't have a choice. It's on their curriculum. And all of us teach in it, so all faculty across all the schools. Within our school, we have the strategic plan, as I mentioned, one of our 4 goals. We have a research center that not only focuses on health equity, but we also have a research center that focuses on LGBT health, and I'm very proud of that research center. Within the Center for Health Equity, we have a community advisory board who voluntarily, faculty members can present their aims page, so not only to the project officer at NIH, but present their aims page to communities to get a reality check. Will this research make a difference? I want to come back to this, this pathway thing. This is where I'm putting my money and my time, is to create a new kind of community in our home at Pitt Public Health. Here you see a set of high school students, and 2 of those high school students that I was privileged to be a mentor for, actually is a high school right next to us. But they never put foot in our school. And so now we've created that pathway, and we surrounded each of these students with mentors that were faculty, PhD students, and master students. And they visited with the mayor, and we're so thankful for having a mayor, Mayor Gainey, who got public health. And his focus is on gun violence. And so he hosted all of the students. So I was so pleased that happened. Climate and health, and yes, we'll deal with COVID and we'll deal with all the other infectious diseases, but climate and health is the singular public health issue that will be for us for a long time because, again, we're unwilling to make changes. And so these are 2 of my students as part of the Public Health Science Academy, the high schoolers that spent a month with us. And they're 15 and 16, so you can't send them really too far. And so this is around our building on De Soto Street, and they were measuring both surface temperature as well as ambient temperature. And here's what they found, and they were quite surprised. If you look on that cell phone, I'm not sure how good you can see it, the ambient temperature that day was 74 degrees. The temperature, however, in the wood chips was 133 degrees. So it doesn't take long to explain that we need trees, but not wood chips. It took 15 and 16-year-olds to get that. We're publishing their research, and I'm so proud of them. We're also very proud, and personally I'm very proud, because I put everything aside that deans do and applied humbly as a principal investigator to this program from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where they bring together, and I'm hoping BU students will join us as well for 8 weeks, undergraduates, so juniors and seniors, and graduates particularly from community colleges to be embedded with us for 8 weeks. And we will focus on the things that matter most, and the things that the city should never be proud of areas: maternal and child health, environmental justice, and climate and health. And so there'll be with us 50 students nationwide, and we'll actually measure what needs to get done. I want to come back to, before we go into this more comprehensive network and talk about what the policies are and how much we're doing. We have a long way to go, as many other universities do. But I want to come back to the issue of cluster hires. Yes, we've invested in 63 cluster hires, both African American and Latinx. And the university is guaranteeing 75% of their salary for the first 4 years. I am going above and beyond that. I am guaranteeing 100% of their salaries for the first 7 years until they go through tenure. So that's a policy that each one of us as deans can undertake beyond even what the university is guaranteeing. And so there are, in this anti-racism framework that's coming from the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, 10 principles and policies, and it's probably a little too small for you to read, but the idea is that we make changes and we make progress in each of those policies. But as we do, we need to create a space where people feel safe to be comfortable and learn. Because not every one of us, although you heard our stories, not every one of us has that same level of comfort. If you remember the educational kind of trajectory from awareness to consciously incompetent, consciously competent, and mastery, we are in the area of awareness and maybe consciously incompetent. We know that we're consciously incompetent. But we're not at competence, and nor are we obviously at mastery. So what is it that we're looking for, and what are some of the policies that we collectively as a family and academia can work on? I'll share with you some of what we're doing. Certainly access, and everybody has the legal issues and affirmative action and EEO. Freedom of speech is a big one for us, and it is true for many of our institutions. We're renaming buildings, and a number of us have done that. Our faculty have voted over the summer to join the union. And so our faculty are now unionized, and that creates a new way of behaving and working as a family. I mentioned the retention issue that we are putting in place, not only the university, but our school specifically. There is a lot that's going on around disciplinary actions, but I'm very hopeful that we are making changes in tenure and promotion. Every course in our school has a required element of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a required element of performance evaluation of our faculty and our staff. I've tried to work on salary equity, but then there was bargaining going on, and so we'll pick that back up again. I want to make sure that we learn from each other as we all embark on changing policy. And so I shared with you where we are, and as you could see, we didn't check any boxes. We didn't check all the boxes. At least we're making progress in some of the boxes. But what I'm particularly proud of our university committing for 15 years an investment in community engagement centers. These are 3 centers in our communities, in our most at-risk communities in Homewood, Hazelwood, and the Hill District, where we're embedding our faculty and our students. So the high school students work there, the CUP students will be there, but also our faculty will be there. And so we're going to the community, not asking the community to come to us. So I'm hoping that this gives you some examples of the kind of policy that we're doing. It leaves me to show you one of the bridges, don't get stuck on them, and to acknowledge my contributor, Dr. Covert, and looking forward to the group discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lichtveld. Our final speaker before we open it up for questions is Dr. Keshia M. Pollack-Porter. Dr. Pollack-Porter is a Bloomberg Centennial Professor and Chair of the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Pollack-Porter also directs the school's Institute for Health and Social Policy and the Health Policy Research Scholars, a national program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Dr. Pollack-Porter conducts research to promote active play and active transportation, safe built environments, transportation equity, and at the nexus of transportation and health. Dr. Pollack-Porter.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for responding. A lot of times people don't, right? I'm thrilled to be here. I want to thank Dean Galea. Great to see you. Thank you for having me. I stand here in front of you today as a child of immigrants, first-generation college student, and I recognize my privilege, and I'm going to talk about how I'm using that in my role as chair, and I'll share a little bit about some stories of some things we're doing at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. A little bit of context for our efforts. In several years, about 2017, 2016, we have a new dean at the school, Dean Ellen McKenzie, who came in and released a new strategic plan for the School of Public Health. And I was privileged that she asked me to be part of her cabinet, and I was the vice dean for faculty at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. And I don't like to say lots of, I was first this or first that, but it's important to name those things and to acknowledge that there needs to be a first in order for there to be second and third and so forth. And so I'm proud to say I was the first Black faculty in the dean's office. And part of that effort, Dean McKenzie also created an office of what we call IDARE, which emphasizes inclusion, diversity, anti-racism, and equity. So you'll hear me use that acronym today, just to sort of be more succinct in my language. But within that process, there were a number of areas identified, including an inaugural dean of IDARE, and this was right before the murder of George Floyd. So you can imagine somebody coming into that space and then amplifying the work based on what we were seeing across the country. In addition, there was a strategic plan that was developed with a lot of community engagement, input from faculty, staff, students, alumni, to come up with those priorities. And I'm privileged that I was involved in those efforts to really engage with faculty. And I'll share with you a little bit about how I've taken that momentum and those goals and have implemented them at the department level at the Bloomberg School. I'm a policy person, so for me, when I think about institutional policy, I'm thinking about formulation. How do we develop policies that are grounded in what we know works? How do we take risks sometimes, because we don't always know what works, and sometimes we need to be innovative and try some things. I think about adoption and also implementation, because we know without solid implementation, our policies fail, and then importance for evaluation and monitoring. So that's a little bit of where I'm coming to for these comments today, but I'm going to focus on the department. So the Department of Health Policy and Management has been around for over 100 years, and it was one of the initial departments at the school when it was founded. And it is one of the largest departments, depending on who you're asking, it's either the third or the fourth largest department. And I have the privilege of being the first Black chair at our School of Public Health. And you might be saying, my gosh, Keshia, it's 2022. But it is the fact, right? And it's long overdue. So I made a choice to start my chair position during Black History Month, even though I was still dean, and I did both for several months, but it was important for me to start at that time. It was significant. So I started that position February 15th this past year, and my department has over 90 faculty and staff and almost 400 students. And why I mention that is to say that as I am leaning into my work related to IDARE, there's a lot of people that I'm moving along to, right? So when I decided to put my name in to be chair of the department, I laid out a clear vision during my interview process, and that was for our school to be a leader among schools of public health, amongst the university that is leaning into IDARE and its faculty, in its scholarship, and how we center staff and community. And I laid that out, and I said to somebody, this will either resonate or it will not. I'm assuming it did because I'm standing here today. Or maybe it didn't, but it resonated with certain people, which is why I'm here today. Either way, people know that as a leader, this is a commitment that I have, is to advancing the principles of inclusion, diversity, anti-racism, and equity. So I want to just give you a few examples of the kinds of things that we're doing. I'll provide a little bit at the school as well from my time when I was in the dean's office and also what I'm doing at the department level. So as far as the school level policies, one of the changes that was made in terms of institutionalizing IDARE and its commitment is that every one of the 10 departments had to name a director, associate, or vice chair for IDARE to be somebody who was leading those efforts at the department level and working with our dean at the school level. When I was in the dean's office, we also standardized the search process. I built on my predecessor's work where we have diversity advocates in every single department, and that person is sought at as an expert and provides implicit bias training, reviews the job descriptions for faculty searches. One of the things that we also ended up doing was that every single search, every candidate has to have a statement of their commitment to IDARE and beyond just, I care about this. It has to be something meaningful and substantive. And the search committee has to be trained with how do you evaluate that? What do you do with that information? One of the things I'm really particularly proud of and relates to some things we heard about today, which was how do we think about this work in the promotions and appointments process? And one of the things that we have at the school is a practice portfolio that we spent the last couple of years working with a colleague of mine, our dean, one of our deans for practice, to update that practice portfolio, where as part of your promotions packet, you lay out the kinds of things you're doing to advance practice. So it's your scholarship or practice, you have your papers, but I'm talking about the doing of the practice, the work that you're doing to work on that report institutionally or internally related to IDARE, related to DEI. Those things can be part of your packet. It goes to the appointment and promotions committee. You include your narrative, you talk about the impact. Somebody said earlier it was about impact. Like this is about the impact of that work. And so I'm thrilled that we are, that's codified and there are guidelines for how to do this, and the committee that oversees promotions and appointments knows how to look at those as well. At the department level, I was really excited to step in as chair earlier this year, and before I did that, I was really was able to help support the person who was stepping in to be our IDARE lead in the department, the associate chair. We've also, since I have stepped in as chair, moved forward with creating different policies related to supporting anti-racist pedagogy and also inclusive excellence. We heard a bit about that from my colleague earlier in terms of what they're doing at their institution, similar things in our department. We also found that we needed to do more to change the culture. So we have been centering IDARE in our joint department meetings every month. We created a new process for confidential reporting so that people didn't always feel comfortable. We have a lot of work to do. Our staff are skeptical of efforts that were maybe believed to have been done without authenticity, without an authentic emphasis. And so I'm working on that, building trust with the staff, and the confidential reporting is, I think, a critical part of that. In the introduction, it was mentioned that I also have the privilege of directing the Health Policy Research Scholars Program, and why I mention that is as we think about educational policies, I'm looking towards that program to see are there strategies that we can promote to institutions regarding funding, stipend, mentoring, other supports that we provide to students in that program to help them be more successful. Because that program is designed for doctoral students from historically marginalized backgrounds who are either from various disciplines who are oftentimes the only fill in the blank at their institution and looking for community, looking to be supported. So we have resources to provide to them. So as I wrap up my time and we move to the panel, I want to share just a few things I've learned throughout this journey in terms of policy change. One is I think it's critical to name what we're focused on and to really be specific about it. Is it DEI? Is it anti-racism? What are we focused on? And communicating a clear narrative and vision for where we want to go. I also think it's critical that we challenge those existing policies that are steeped in colonial white supremacist culture. Again, naming those, identifying those, and seeking to dismantle those. I find it's incredibly helpful in all of my policy work to identify those policy champions and identifying our white allies in this work. I'm at a predominantly white institution, and certainly voices of many people are critical to the efforts. Also want to highlight the importance of centering voices from scholars, communities, students of color, and people from historically marginalized backgrounds. Again, having a seat at the table. And if there's not an opportunity for them to be at the table, be sponsors. Those of us at the tables have a responsibility to lift up voices of individuals who are not at the table with us. I want to emphasize the importance I've also learned of collecting data so that we can monitor and evaluate our supports and hold ourselves accountable. I also want to share the importance of prioritizing self-care. This is hard work. It is tiring work, and it is absolutely fair for us to make time and space to take care of ourselves while we are continuing to fight the good fight to advance inclusion, diversity, anti-racism, and equity. And then finally, I think it's critical that we imagine a better world. What do we want our institutions to be? What's the vision for that, and how can we lean in and develop policies that can help us achieve those goals? So thank you very much. Here's my contact information. Happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pollack Porter. We now invite all of the panelists to come up. I'm thinking actually that maybe the three of us can sit in the first three seats for the microphone. As a reminder for those online, please submit your questions to the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll have microphones around the room for questions to be asked. I'm going to sit there if that's okay. Be asked in person. And excellent. Thank you so much. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A, and so I'm going to ask just a few questions, and then I want to keep at least 10 minutes to turn it over for the audience. So I'll ask 2 or 3 questions depending on how time goes. And I want to begin by just noting each of you have talked about, from your perspective, what is key to building anti-racist institutions and how academic institutional policies bolster transformative change work. Many of you offered great examples and made a case for this. We online have about 300 attendees from institutions all over the country and all over the world, as well as many people here from Boston University. And I'm hoping that since we have people from so many different places who are interested in this work, if you were to offer consultation to colleagues who are wanting to create anti-racist policies, from your perspective, where is a good place to begin?
Do you want to just go?
You want us to go in order?
Well, you can go, whoever would like to go.
I will just offer something very quickly, which is, in my view, developing anti-racist policies is incumbent on examining other policies that currently exist at your institutions. So if you dig deeply into bylaws and you dig deeply into promotion and tenure guidelines, you will find evidence in there that probably are elements that run counter to anti-racist policies. So before you build new policies, examine the policies that exist there, disaggregate them, and find what has to be modified or changed there in order to enable the other and newer anti-racist policies to complement that. Otherwise, it's not I don't think it's going to work, quite frankly.
I mean, I don't have a lot to add to that. I agree. I believe there has to be an initial, authentic is a word that was used earlier, assessment, baseline assessment, in order to build on what is already there.
Without changing culture, no policy will matter. So invest in changing culture first.
I would say ditto to all of the comments before, and I would just add too, I would encourage people to look at their leaders and promote and support development of leaders who are in positions who can be those policy champions for this work, in addition to everything that has been said before.
Yeah, and I'm an epidemiologist by training, can't help but get away from the data. Mm-hmm. And I want to just offer a quick example. I'm not picking on an institution, but the former institution I was in had a real commitment to increasing diversity in their medical student class. And what they did is they were admitting higher numbers of medical students, and the majority of them were coming from out of state. So if you can get the link, when you're coming to a state institution and paying out-of-state tuition, you're paying about twice the tuition as your in-state peers. And then, if you're a minority, the best chance for you getting in is coming from out of state. So it also bakes in disparaging minorities who are in state. And then we've got this thing where we say we want to increase the number of Black and brown or diverse physicians in our state, yet we're disparaging them in the admissions process. So and this happens all across the country. You got these so-called well-meaning schools, and specifically medical schools. I am going to pick on them for a second. Medical schools who will take minority physicians in training from out of state and saddle them down with twice the debt as their white counterparts, and then expect them to go and practice in primary care, where it just, like, can you see how it feeds on itself? And so I do agree there's a cultural shift that's needed, but in the meantime, the data can be our guide. And while we continue to do the work to work on hearts and minds, we need data and solid policies that say we won't do that. Where's the actual number that says we have to accept X percentage of minorities from within the state? We have to make sure that debt is not disproportionately hoisted upon out-of-state minority physicians, right? If you can get that kind of stuff baked in and get people to see this thing around checking off boxes that might have been well-intentioned actually furthered inequity, I think the hearts and minds and cultural shift will eventually follow. But people gotta have their hand forced, I believe, to do the right thing sometimes.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you for the examples that you've each provided. I'm trying to decide. I'm going to only ask one more because I want to give time for folks. I guess I'll focus on lessons learned. So institutions of higher education are often slow to change, which we've noted, and there's lots of barriers and challenges that happen along the way to making change, particularly around policy work to make it lasting. And a lot of times it lives with people, so if a person leaves a role or leaves an institution, oftentimes a program or practice might shift. Policy helps institutionalize it in some more substantive ways. So I'm curious what you perceive to be the greatest challenges or barriers to inclusive, anti-racist policy work, and if you're comfortable sharing your lessons learned.
Do we start backwards?
Sure.
Why don't we, I just feel like if each one of us answers every question, so I took more time last time, I'll let somebody else just jump in and answer that one.
Important lessons learned are that we don't spend enough time, we get a lot of groundswell around development. We don't spend enough time around carrots and sticks to enforce and entice. And we definitely don't spend enough time to collect data to see if it works. So we are not answering the so what question. We're too enthusiastic about starting, but then the energy wanes when we need to look, well, did it work? And are we bold enough to say, it didn't work. Let's try again. But if we don't collect data, we don't know whether something works or not. And those are, I think, key lessons for us collectively to learn, is that not invest only in the startup, but invest when it's not sexy. Invest in the maintenance and the sustaining of it.
I mean, I would say that it's very easy for institutions to check boxes. And I think several colleagues have said that. We have a chancellor for DEIJ. Woo, that means we're great. We have this, scholars program that funds people for 5 years. Woo! But what we don't do when we bring underrepresented minority scholars into our institutions, or first-gen scholars, is very often we don't develop paths for success for them. And I think, just as we think about when we're teaching children, there has to be a path and a trajectory for their learning to grow. What we need to do as deans, with our collaborators, our colleagues at our school, is develop very, very clear prescribed paths for success that are true to, one, the realities of the tenure and promotion processes that we're all living with, and mine are really, really, really bad. But two, that do not neglect the identity and the work of the person. And how you can do that is not so easy, because very often the scholarship that is community engaged that is working with and for people is viewed as lesser, right? I mean, I've spent a lot of time saying, what do you mean community engaged research? You mean research, right? Kind of like, what do you mean mental health? You mean health, right? Right, and so the more we other things, the more things get cast aside. But I think creating that, and that's what we've been doing at Rutgers. From the moment folks come in, creating a clear pathway that can be changed over the course of time, that is going to get each person at the end of the period towards tenure to succeed.
Maybe I could just amplify the comment and just say, I think there's the importance of implementation. I cannot underscore that, right? It's not enough to say, here's the policy we're going to go ahead and do. How is it actually being implemented?
Yeah.
What are the unintended consequences of what you're doing? Are you monitoring it? Are you grabbing the data? Are you looking at the data? Just such an important, I've learned so many lessons around the implementation of these policies that I think are just critical for everybody to consider.
And be willing to de-implement
That's
when
right.
things
Yes, that's
aren't
right.
working.
That's right.
Correct.
Right? Like, there's an expression, if you're gonna fail, fail fast. I'm not saying that here, but we are public health people. Data is underneath of what we do and all that other stuff. So I just echo the comments that have been said and said there's nothing wrong with saying, wow, well-intentioned, but it had an unintended negative consequence. And so we have to either de-implement or pause and reimagine and use good examples, right? Like, there's some places, and we heard many of people who are doing great programs that are working well, that they're trying to get institutionalized. We shouldn't be reinventing the wheel and just making up stuff as we go along.
Can I add something to what Debra said? I hate the myth of the monolith, right? What I refer to as the myth of the monolith. Black people, they're all the same. Gay people, they're all the same, right? And in fact, we know that everyone has intersectional identities. So that's why, to your point, Debra, and the data should inform the paths, right? Because the data of the people, and the paths can all be different, right? They do not have to be the same. But we tend to think we want everybody to squarely fit into one way of doing, and that's a recipe for failure.
Starts with our U.S. Census.
That
Well, I didn't
actually,
even count my identity on the U.S. Census, so.
that actually ties into what I was going to ask, but around intersectionality. But I will wait and let folks in the audience ask questions. I will say, because I asked about barriers, that I really appreciated the sticky tensions that Dr. Ford presented. And I think that those speak to some of those barriers as well. So yes, yes, we have someone in the back with a mic.
Hi, thank you so much for a fantastic panel and for really showing us what can be achieved with aspirational leadership, and 7 years of funding for scholars is remarkable, so thank you for that. I wonder what we can aspire to for students of color, and some of the structural supports and investments we can make, as well as how we can overcome some of the barriers. I know in our department we rethought our qualifying exam and how we could support people in overcoming that hurdle rather than just erecting a hurdle. And so I wonder what advice you have on structural investments and how we can really invest in supporting students who do face wealth inequities, who do face structural challenges, less mentorship coming into programs. Thank you.
I'll say one thing. I'm a program kid. Like, I came from really smart, hardworking people. I was the first person in my family to go to college. And I participated in programs that made the difference for me. I was in a program, I got in the talented and gifted program in kindergarten on this simple thing, drawing circles. I got in a talented and gifted. I was in a summer program in middle school, in high school, then in college, and I got a full ride to Hopkins, right? If somebody tried to bridge my gaps, or if those gaps, the programs and the support started for me in college, I don't know that it would have been possible for me. Like, I got opportunities at kindergarten, right? So even though I might have come from a poor, working poor family of good people, educationally, I was sharp as a whip. I came in and was outperforming some of my, prep school educated peers in undergrad. So the thought that we can just, at the level of graduate school or even junior faculty, bridge all these gaps, we can, but let's be honest, the structural and systemic problems that we've been talking about, which are mostly undergirded with systemic racism and these embedded ideals around white supremacy, we've got to start addressing that much earlier in people's lives. opportunity is not even, but brilliance and talent and all that is. Some of us just don't get it cultivated early enough, and then it feels like a handout being given to us. And it actually, I think, furthers some racist ideology that somehow we gotta do it for these people because they can't quite do it for themselves. It's just, we gotta start earlier.
So hence my personal investment in working with high school students, in working with college students, in teaching in every single course in our Bachelor's of Science in Public Health program. I look at the two programs, the MPH and the BSPH. In the MPH, we're about 22% diverse. In the BSPH, we're 51% diverse. So we're getting the opportunity. Are we collectively taking the opportunity as faculty and leaders? I think that's where we need to show and model.
I would also add that it's important, as I understand the educational literature, the little bit that I do understand, is that many of the Black and Latinx students who enter our programs are actually from high-achieving families. And often we do a disservice by not holding our Black, Indigenous, and people of color students to the same standards that we hold other students to. And so on the one hand, there is this need to recognize the ways in which structural racism has structured and tracked people down different educational paths. And when we admit students, regardless, there are a variety of reasons why we may admit students from diverse backgrounds, that we are making a commitment to carry them, not to carry them, let me just change my wording, to make sure that they are prepared to earn the degrees that they're pursuing.
I'd offer two suggestions. One, bringing public health to the people, which means being out there and being a face and a voice for public health in a real intangible way so that people understand, like children, adolescents understand like your program, what public health is. Oh, I want to do what Pepperson does. That seems like really cool to me, and do it in a way that's accessible, right? I think that's really important. But number two, I'm a huge Vygotskian. I totally believe in the mentor-apprentice relationship. And I think that, of course, it should happen from elementary school on, right? But if it can't, and it starts with our MPH programs, what I tell our students when they come to our school is find that faculty member who works in an area that you're interested in. Work with them somehow, because the classroom learning is great, awesome, but what you're going to do in the lab or in the program or on the journal is going to be alive. And that's what I think is a really critical piece in helping students succeed.
So we're actually at time, but do you think we could take one more question from online? Yep, okay.
On the lines.
Does the tenure system create inequities? Or more to the point, would eliminating the tenure system provide a more equitable landscape in the academy?
I have long thought that if people got tenure based on one significant contribution to the field, that would be better than filling the literature with a bunch of fluff. So I do believe that the tenure system is really important for people who do work that is not widely accepted or popular, for people who do work that's controversial. So and also as a librarian, I certainly would not advocate getting rid of that protection. But I do think, obviously, the tenure system does need attention.
The tenure system works if it doesn't perpetuate sameness. Unfortunately, the tenure system right now is perpetuating sameness. And so I think we want it. We want people to feel safe, to be able to say what they want to say. But I want, my faculty to be rewarded for the op-eds they write, that 700,000 people read as compared to the 7 people who read their high H-indexed article, right? But, whenever I say that, at my institution, it's like I have 12 heads, and I'm saying that. But that's, I think, a step in the direction. Don't get rid of tenure, rethink what constitutes tenure.
Thank you. This has been a really phenomenal panel. We appreciate all that you've contributed today. And I will turn it back over to Dean Galea. Thank you.
I just want to echo thank you. That was really, really interesting. you weren't able to see the comments on Zoom, but Zoom was sort of on fire with responding to some of your comments. So thank you. I really learned a lot from all of you. And thank you to everybody in the audience, both physically and on Zoom. Thank you for being here and for everything you do. Have a good afternoon, everybody.